by this point, you'll probably have noticed I have been dressed the same in all these videos. That's because I'm filming a bunch on the same day. Because it is really hard for me to film during weekdays when I am going to work. So basically the weekend is the only time I have. And I'm trying to get it so my schedule is basically I'm releasing stuff on Saturdays and Sundays on the weekends and not doing these sporadic video releases all over the place. I just do not have the ability or time to do it during the school year while I'm working. So we're trying to work this out a little more evenly so it's not like huge gaps between when I upload stuff. This is the third book of my 5 for 5 that I finished, The King in Yellow by Robert Chambers. This is one of the sort of big names that influenced H.P. Lovecraft, and you can really see it in some of his more well-known short stories. My understanding of Chambers is he actually was more of a light novelist. He wrote basically stuff that was kind of fluffy, popular fiction and stuff, and then all of a sudden he whips out this set of short stories, which the latter part I would say are just kind of fluffy fantasy type things. In fact, they're completely unmemorable and I find them very boring. If you really want to read anything by him that is actually notable and memorable, stick to the actual short story, The King in Yellow. Well, not the actual short story, King in Yellow. It's The Repair of Reputations, which is the one that's the most well-known of all of these, probably. There are 4 short stories he has that make up this King in Yellow cycle. They are 4 short stories, and then it starts going into these other short stories that have nothing to do with anything that he was writing about. The King in Yellow is the play. The King in Yellow is a fictitious play that ties these 4 together, and one of the stories it doesn't even really tie together in with it that well. But the idea is The King in Yellow is this play that when people read it, they have a tendency to go crazy, or it corrupts them in some way. It is very, very much like a Necronomicon type of thing, like the book in Evil Dead. It's kind of like all these different sort of ideas of this corrupted item that when people interact with it, it is evil and will influence you. And I don't know if this is the first case of that, but it is one of the first that I've seen or heard of that is very closely tied with that sort of idea about books in general and stories having this sort of power. The actual play you never really get to see except like a couple supposed lines from it. It's apparently set in this sort of fantasy world that, there's in the play there is this person called the King in Yellow. Now that's a lot of symbolism. Yellow tends to be a color that is associated with illness and insanity. If you're talking about the yellow wallpaper, if you're talking about basically like if you hear about the 4 Riders of the Apocalypse, the one that is often shown in yellow, I believe, is Pestilence, is most often seen in kind of a yellowish because outfit. So this is kind of the idea of this kind of corrupting, evil, degenerate influence. And the latter 3 stories are tied in with that. The second one's kind of a good for just a fantasy like an interesting sort of fantasy. It's called, that one's The Mask. That one's just kind of an interesting fantasy story, and that one is very, very tenuously tied to the whole King in Yellow situation. The most famous one is The Repair of Reputations, which is the first one, and I would say it's the best one too, because you realize that you realize you have a very unreliable narrator, and you realize in stuff that he is saying that he is insane. And so you're basing what he's saying about you have this idea that it's kind of this futuristic fantasy world. Basically, the world has gone in this kind of corrupted, crazy way. There are sort of these like boxes where people can off themselves if they want to. There's this King in Yellow play that the main character says that he read and is now kind of, you find out that he's been in an institution. He's really, really sensitive about that, and he's kind of interacting with his cousin who showed up, and his cousin's very, very nice and is looking to get married. And you start seeing that these delusions are making your main character just sort of kind of go off the deep end here. And you have stuff where you realize that he's not sane. And like, he talks about the fact that he said, come, old fellow, he cried, take off, his cousin. He said, come, old fellow, take off that brass crown and toddle into the study. Are you going into a masquerade? What's all that theatrical tinsel anyway? I was glad he thought the crown was made of brass and paste, yet I didn't like him any better for thinking so. So his cousin walks in, and he's wearing this, he keeps describing it as this, like, crown jewel that he has. He's found out that he feels like he is related to the people who should be in charge, and he should be royalty, and that he's done all his like all this sort of hereditary stuff where he's found out that he's should be king, he feels like. And he said, well, I've even got the crown jewels and whatever. And then you kind of realize from the cousin talking that it's like this fake plastic brass crown that he's got on, and his cousin's like, what are you doing? And then immediately afterwards, he said that an alarm goes off, and he said the alarm ceased as infernal din at once. He watched me curiously, but not seem to notice the sudden ceasing of the alarm. He did, however, speak of the safe as a biscuit box. So he thinks he's putting his crown in this safe that he has with an alarm and all this sort of thing. And his cousin's like, okay, you're putting that in the biscuit box. So you start to realize that this character is very, very messed up in all of this, and then it kind of just devolves into kind of your big finale at the end. The Repairer of Reputations is this person that you can go to, and he will fix stuff that has kind of happened in your background, and he's kind of a side character in all this, but you don't even really know if he's real or not. There's a weirdness there too. The thing I think people talk about with Chambers and find notable with Chambers is the fact that he has a very distinct tone. There is a level with his tone that is not kind of a... I've heard somebody say it's like he's lived this and was there. And it is kind of interesting because there is a visceralness to it. Which is a little like Lovecraft. Some of Lovecraft's stuff there is a visceralness to that feels like either this person has dreamed this, or this is this person's nightmare, or what they are really afraid of, and have a deep, this kind of deep-seated terror. And I think that's kind of the feeling. It doesn't feel as much to me in the other short stories. It does, particularly in the Repair of Reputations, because it really does. I've not really seen an unreliable narrator outside of Poe sometimes, but an unreliable narrator written so kind of manic, but also with enough in the story that you can also figure out, you as the reader can also notice how unstable this person is. Even though what they're saying makes sense, it's actually a really good balance, because it's this feeling of what he's saying makes sense, but then you have other comments that are thrown in here and other observations and different things that you realize, oh no, he is completely lost in the sauce. So that is actually something that is kind of cool about that story. If I really had to say, I would say that one is probably the only thing of Chambers you really need to read. The rest of them are just kind of eh. The Court of the Dragon is very short, and it kind of ties into this whole situation again with the King in Yellow and an unstable narrator. and different sorts of things. And none of them are as good. The other ones that tie in, none of them are as good as the Repair of Reputations. The King in Yellow is one of these sort of kind of forgotten short stories by a forgotten writer a little bit, and it came back into prominence more recently when that True Detective series used that in the first season as a big motif of the King in Yellow, and this whole sort of idea of that tying into all the murders and different things, and sort of a supernatural element a little bit. I like the idea. I like the motif that is being used with this kind of thing that keeps popping up that is very, very bad. I like that. I do think the short story that uses it the best is The Repair of Reputations. And if you have to read just one short story from Chambers, read The Repair of Reputations. That is the best one. That is the strongest one, and that is the one that I would pull out of the collection and be like, this is a really, really well-written version of a non-reliable narrator that I would then say, I would give to a student and say, here, and then show me how this guy is unreliable, because it's really easy to pick out. The one we always use in school is the Telltale Heart. He's unreliable. This one I actually think is even more, you have even more ability to point out the fact that, oh no, this is not what it seems on the surface as it continues to go on, because you have all these context clues that are happening that are actually more context clues than the Telltale Heart. But this is the third of my 5 books. 5 Before You Buy here, so I'm moving on. I still have that Meriwether Lewis biography and that book about hauntings and history of hauntings and seances and stuff like that. So trying to get those done before I move on to another 5.